Olympic fever has gripped Brazil and the world, and there really wasn't any other topic we could dare to talk about this week. Footage of the Paris Games is everywhere in Brazil, at home, at work, on public transportation, in hospital waiting rooms. And it seems like every single member of the Brazilian population is watching the events on their TV, computers, and smartphones. And it's that time of the year when you go into a bakery shop and you see canoes, slalom on, and everybody's scotched to the TV. And then the baker looks at you and said, well, I think Slovakia is coming with everything they have this year. And then you answer that maybe so, but that you're rooting for Latvia, as if any one of the two had any idea what they were talking about. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Brazilian Report, and this is Explaining Brazil.
If you like Explaining Brazil, you should subscribe to our website, The Brazilian Report, which is the journalistic engine behind this podcast. Or you can go the extra mile and make a donation to our newsroom, tipping our journalists via our Buy Me a Coffee page. And you can also subscribe to our Buy Me a Coffee fan page, pledging a monthly contribution to our newsroom in exchange for exclusive content that you won't find anywhere else. Our Buy Me a Coffee subscribers are Wild Rice, Jaciara de Oliveira, Carson Allen, Gabriel Luca, Andrei Novoseltsev, Pan Ludwig, Leslie Seal, Mark Hillary, Louise Renz, Erwan Menais, Aaron Berger, Kars Vrieswick, Alistair Townsend, Miller Renarcido, Peter Abramson, David Dixon, Jose Ozzy Stankovic, Emerging Market Muser, Anna Lund, Peter Suffren, Anderson da Silva, and someone who chose to remain anonymous. And our Buy Me a Coffee members come from all over the world, so please, if we're butchering the pronunciation of your name, please send us an email. If you too believe in the importance of independent journalism, and if you want to hear your name on our podcast, go to buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report and subscribe to one of our membership levels. Click on buymeacoffee.com/Brazilian Report to find out more.
Okay, so we're past the halfway point on this edition of the Olympic Games. And at the time of the recording of this episode, Brazil had won a total of 13 medals, good enough for the 16th position in the medal table. So we won 2 gold with Beatriz Souza in the judo competition and Rebeca Andrade in the floor competition in artistic gymnastics, as well as 5 silvers and 6 bronze. Some were positive surprises, some were negative surprises. And for this week's episode, we're going to break it all down with Ewan Marshall, deputy editor of the Brazilian Report. Hi, Ewan.
Hi, Gustavo. Great to be here.
And we are also delighted to welcome Alexia Massoud to the show. She's a journalism student at George Washington University, and she has been doing some excellent work interning at the Brazilian Report over the past couple of months. Hi, Alexia.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
So in the first half of today's show, we're going to look at some of the biggest Brazilian results so far in Paris, how the games are being received in Brazil, and what we should be looking ahead to in the remaining days of the events. And then in part 2, we're going to look at what happens before and after the Olympics, namely how athletes are funded, how they're making a living, and where Brazil could be doing better. So without further ado, let's dive in. Ewan, let's start with you. So I mentioned a little bit about Brazil's results in terms of medals. And this Olympics, for Brazilians, is kind of a roller coaster in terms of emotions because we had some unexpected medals coming our way, but we also had athletes that we thought were a lock in terms of their medal potential that fell short of the podium, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been this, as you say, quite up and down. In Brazil, there seems to be this expectation almost from most of the general public that everything's going to go okay and that all of the Brazilian athletes are going to win gold, even though people aren't really keeping up with these sports. Even when they're not particularly favourites, they believe that they're going to go in there with a chance of winning. And that hasn't always been the case. And even with a lot of these athletes who haven't necessarily won gold or even won medals, A lot of them have, put up excellent performances, season best, personal best, national records, all that sort of stuff. And it's been clouded a little bit, I think, because maybe Brazil's medal count isn't quite as high as it should be. And we'll get onto that at some point. But I think, the one that everyone was talking about before it happened, and everyone has been basically talking about non-stop since, was Rebeca Andrade's gold medal that you mentioned, which happened on Monday morning, quite early on Monday morning, in the floor exercise final of the artistic gymnastics. And this was, just such a kind of spectacular event, I think, for Brazilian fans of sport. And, the significance, obviously, of beating Simone Biles, the United States gymnast, potentially the greatest gymnast of all time, getting more points than her, above her on the podium, and,
And also the first ever to beat Biles on a floor exercise in a major competition, right? So it's even more of an accomplishment what Rebeca Andrade did on Monday.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've got a couple more facts then, just to bring us in on Rebeca Andrade, just to kind of contextualize this a little bit more. I mean, that is her 6th Olympic medal in her career, which makes her the most kind of successful Olympian in Brazil's history. That's also her 4th Olympic medal just at this Paris Games, which means that she has the equal highest total of medals for any athlete who is not a swimmer. And that's also her 2nd gold medal in her history. She won the vault final in the 2020 Tokyo Games, but importantly, Simone Biles wasn't competing against her in that particular event. She had pulled out of that competition. And yeah, it's just, I think, as you mentioned just at the start there, that there is this kind of up and down roller coaster sort of thing with some people, doing well, some people doing not so well. And I think maybe on Monday morning, just before that floor final, there was a bit of maybe pessimism was just starting to creep in with a lot of Brazilian fans, thinking, this is the last gymnastics event. It's probably not going to be a gold again. Who knows if Rebeca Andrade can manage this, Simone Biles that, all that sort of thing. And then, we saw a couple of mistakes from Simone Biles, and we saw Rebeca Andrade doing what Rebeca Andrade does. She's, the gymnast. She's very kind of tight in everything that she does. She's very precise, very elegant, and she managed to score high, and she managed to win that gold.
And can you tell us a little bit more about Rebeca Andrade? Who is she? I mean, the fact that the biggest Brazilian Olympian ever is a Black woman is something that did not go unnoticed in Brazil. So can you tell us a little bit more about her upbringing and how she became this icon of Brazilian sports?
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe a year ago you would have a lot more people who were unaware of who Rebeca Andrade was, but she's no unknown. I mean, even in the US, the sports press have been bigging her up before this Olympics as being, she's the only one who can compete with Simone Biles, and also drawing a lot of comparisons between the two of them in terms of their background and their upbringing. And I think it's fascinating because when you have Rebeca Andrade has one of those stories where she grew up in a very poor neighborhood in Guarulhos, just beside the city of São Paulo. She has 7 siblings. She was brought up by a single mother. And, all those stories of, it took her, 2 hours to get to training. Her big sister had to walk her to training, took, 2 hours there, 2 hours back. Her mother was working as a maid, cleaning houses of rich families to pay for Rebeca's training. And what's kind of spectacular about this is that, I mean, that's a story that is just repeated almost constantly when we're talking about Brazilian sportsmen and women. That in itself is that is almost the norm when it comes to Brazilian sports, and it's just this constant kind of overcoming obstacles and overcoming adversity, which you can really, just in that basic part of her life story of Rebeca Andrade is already really quite apparent. But then there's other things which are potentially even more amazing, is that, Rebeca Andrade has three times in the space of, just a few years, I think it was 6 years, she had 3 anterior cruciate ligament surgeries, reconstruction surgeries on her right knee, which one ACL injury like that can be enough to end careers of many sports people. And she had 3 surgeries, 3 ACL surgeries, and she's still at the top of her game. She's an Olympic champion. And, there's just, she's famous in Brazil as well for when she needs to read her scores, she has to put her glasses on because, like me, she's slightly visually impaired. So, there's just been so many moments in her life where the odds were just saying, yeah, you're probably not going to make it as far as you're going to make it. And she just, she has overcome those odds constantly to become, one of the best gymnasts in the world and certainly the best in Brazil's history. And as you mentioned there, I mean,
no, and even if I can add just something, not just Rebeca, because Brazil's gymnastics as a team, it won a medal for the first time. It won bronze on the all-around competition. And, I mean, there is something that if it were an Olympic sport, Brazil would certainly win gold, which is the production of memes. And there were a lot of memes talking about the fact that, for instance, soccer players, especially Neymar, if you touch them, they start rolling on the ground. And then the Brazilian gymnasts, they fell, they opened their eyebrows, they were bleeding, their face was bleeding. And then they went there, they performed, and they won the bronze medal.
Yeah, and this is certainly, it's a lot of these kind of qualities that has really endeared a lot of these athletes to the Brazilian public, and especially this women's gymnastics team. And I mean, Rebeca Andrade, as everyone in Brazil will know at the moment, she's just absolutely like the darling of Brazil. It's her country, and we're all living in it. We're surrounded by memes and little videos of Rebeca Andrade giving interviews. Famous ones of her being asked, like, what does she think about before she does her routine in the Olympic finals? And she says that she's thinking about all the recipes that she's seen on TikTok that she wants to make when she goes back to Brazil. Apparently the night before the floor exercise final, she fell asleep watching Grey's Anatomy, imagining that she was a surgeon. I mean, it's just, as I say, it's her country at the moment, and we're living in it. But the significance of the amount of not only black athletes but also black female athletes in Brazil is quite astounding. I mean, Rebeca Andrade won Brazil's second gold medal at this Olympic Games, and the first gold medal was won by Beatriz Souza in the judo, another black woman. And it's amazing that obviously black women around the world are still a very marginalized population, but in Brazil that marginalization of black women is just so much more apparent, and for that still to be the demographic that is leading, the Olympic delegation. There's more women than men, for example, this year in the Paris Olympics Brazil team, and for them to be winning the medals and kind of bringing home the bacon, as it were, it's just hugely symbolic.
Now, you talked a little bit about the highs of Brazil's first days in Paris. I'm going to bring Alexia in to talk a little bit about the lows, because especially in the first week of the Olympics, Brazil was handed some brutal losses, and by coincidence, a bunch of them were handed by Japan, right? So, Alexia, can you tell us a little bit about how Brazilians reacted to that? Some saying that it was Japan's revenge for us putting cream cheese on sushi.
Yeah, so a lot of memes have come and been generated online. There are a lot of memes about the Brazil and Japan rivalry, which isn't exactly a rivalry, but people are really upset about Brazil losing to Japan time and time again. In the women's rugby, we lost to Japan twice. And one of the comebacks was Gabriel Medina in that legendary picture, that epic picture of him holding his hand up, floating in the air with his surfboard, photographed by a French photographer. And he won a 9.9. He scored 9.9 on his wave, which was a legendary comeback to beat the Japanese surfer who beat him in Tokyo 2020. So Brazilians went crazy over that, and the memes online have just been phenomenal. Some implying that if capoeira was a event in the Olympics, Japanese would find a way to beat Brazilians. If funk was an event in the Olympics, Japan would beat them again. So a lot of memes are going crazy online, and it's been fun to watch.
Now, even Alexia mentioned Gabriel Medina, and he surfed a perfect wave. He was shot in a perfect picture, but that wasn't enough for him, right? Because he then lost in the semifinals and had to settle for the bronze medal. And I want to bring Medina in because there was some controversy in the surfing competition with a Brazilian surfer who is not in the Olympics raising some flags that a judge was cozying up to the Australian surfer that ended up beating Medina in the semifinals. And that also ties with some of the conspiracy theories in Brazil that we have, that every time we lose a competition is not because the other team had its merits, but because we were robbed by the refs.
I mean, yeah, it's certainly a lot easier, I think, to just say that it's the judge's fault or the referee's fault. And it ties into something that we've been talking about already in this show about just, the expectations for Brazilian athletes they're often just quite unrealistic. We see a lot of the coverage that we get on the televised broadcasts of the Olympics in Brazil. And as I mentioned earlier, they're talking up these athletes as in, this is a medal chance, this is a chance of gold, this athlete is going to come away with something here. And then even if the athlete gives their personal best, as has been the case in some of these events, and still, maybe finishes fourth or fifth or even lower, even at the bottom of the pile, but still is producing, a Brazilian record, the come down has been really quick. After the realization that there's not a medal coming, there's not a gold coming, there has always been this kind of quick kind of mea culpa from the broadcasters of being like, oh, I'm sorry, we got your hopes up there. Maybe it wasn't realistic after all. And I think that just puts a lot more pressure on these athletes.
I remember one time I was watching a swimming qualification, and the commentator was like, "Oh, the Brazilian swimmer just started amazingly," and then the pro swimmer that was bringing some insight was like, no, he didn't. He started off pretty terribly. So at least some of the broadcasts had these pros to temper down expectations. But even so, like you said, we're always led to believe that the gold medal is within reach, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And Alexia, we are seeing, like, everywhere you go, you have a TV on with the Olympics. How important is the Olympics to Brazil, especially if you compare, for instance, to the United States where you live? You're Brazilian, you're studying in the US, back to Brazil for your internship. So how can you compare the Olympic spirit in both countries, the US being an Olympic juggernaut and Brazil not quite?
So, in my opinion, the United States has a lot of infrastructure for athletes. They have a lot of support for athletes. Professional teams are more prominent and they receive a lot of funding, especially track and field is one of the sports in the US that is highly, highly funded. And there are so many athletes. So the US has a really large delegation in the Olympics. They have the largest delegation, and they're often able to send all these athletes because of their infrastructure. So I think Brazil being highlighted in the Olympics as they have been. So, for example, Rebeca Andrade shining light to Brazil and to herself has been a huge way for Brazil to come back to the center stage. So I believe that all the funding and a study came out recently from Ponto Map, which is a data intelligence agency in Brazil, and they have released that the Brazilian government has put in about 43.9 billion reais into sports in the past 20 years, and medals have proportionally increased with that funding. So I believe that if Brazil...
that is not even $1 billion, right? Even if it's the most that Brazil has ever spent, it dwarfs in comparison to the hundreds of millions and billions that we see in university sports programs across the U.S. So it's still a very tiny investment compared to other countries.
I totally agree. You're completely right. And to Brazil, that seems like a large investment, or at least larger than it used to be, because in the past 3 years, 2021 to 2023, we've invested about 7.3 billion reais, which 20 years ago wasn't even close. So now the Brazilian government is starting to invest a lot more money into sports, and I think that's the right way to get closer to, some countries like the US, where they stand with sports, for example, because I see tracks everywhere in the US. They're really common, but here in Brazil, I don't see tracks for people to be able to practice, for the youth to be able to practice sports and get into athletics the way that they're able to do so in the US.
And you would notice, right? Because you're a runner yourself.
Yeah, I would, for sure.
What do
In
you?
the US,
Which competitions do you run?
I typically do the 400-meter dash or the 800-meter dash, but in between those two are my favorite distances.
Alexia's modesty doesn't let her say that, but she was once a record breaker in her own college, right, Alexia?
Yeah, I held that record for a little bit.
And maybe a new Olympic hope for Brazil come Los Angeles?
Well, I would totally choose to represent Brazil, just like Tatiana Weston Webb, who moved to Hawaii when she was little, but chose to come back to represent Brazil and now won silver. So I would totally do that.
And Alexia, you were talking about the investment that the Brazilian government has put into its sports program. I mean, a lot of that was driven by Rio 2016 when Brazil hosted the Olympic and wanted to have its best results ever. It had at the time. Then it was even better in the London Games with 21 total medals. Did we see a return to normalcy after the Rio Olympic cycle, or investments continue to go up even after the Olympics in Brazil?
So we released an article about that on the website a couple of weeks ago, and we saw that a study was published by Fundação Getúlio Vargas talking about the legacy left by Rio 2016, and there are still things that are incoming, some infrastructure things that were supposed to have finished by the end of the Olympics, but they're still ongoing. And the legacy left was enormous. We made almost 100 billion reais in revenue, which was equal to almost $20 billion at that time. And then also a bunch of jobs generated, almost 470,000 jobs. So the Rio Olympics left a huge legacy for Brazil, and we're still coming off of that legacy.
And even going specifically to the grants that we give to athletes, the so-called Bolsa Atleta, can you tell us a little bit more to our foreign audience how it works? Because we have different tiers. We have, the amount you get from the government goes up or down depending on your performance on top-notch competitions, right?
Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of basic funding mechanism that the Brazilian government will give to sportsmen and women, as you say, called the Bolsa Atleta, which is like the athletics scholarship sort of thing, loosely translated as that. And yeah, I think Alexia probably has the more detailed figures on this, but yeah, you do have this kind of sliding scale of different kind of different umbrellas that you would have for these athletes. The ones that are closer to potentially, Olympic competition or potentially winning medals in Olympic competition will be receiving, the highest tier of subsidies per month. And whereas those who are maybe just starting out, maybe in different sports at a lower level, the stipend is going to be a lot lower. But I think, the interesting thing, I mean, as I say, I think Alexia has a bit more in terms of the actual figures there. But I think the interesting thing is how, that's often not enough. It's not enough by itself for a lot of athletes, because, unless you're the creme de la creme, you're really gonna, you're gonna need a second job, or you're gonna need some other sort of funding, whether that be from your own family, or whether that be through sponsorships, or whether that be through clubs, or, and again, in another example, another phenomenon which is interesting in Brazilian Olympic sports is sometimes that funding comes from the armed forces as well, which is something interesting to get into. But as I say, in terms of the actual figures there, I think Alexia will have us covered on that.
Right. Alexa, can you tell us a little bit, because you've written another article on the funding per Olympic cycle. So, and you said that the medal count is proportional to the amount spent. Are we spending more? Have we spent more for Paris than we did in previous cycles, or after Rio, things weighing down a little bit?
So the figures for the Olympics haven't come out yet, but I do think that we've been increasingly spending more. As I said before, in the past 3 years, the total came out to 7.3 billion, I believe. So that has been a large increase over the past few years, and the medals have grown since as well. The study said that at the recent Olympics, we've gotten 19 medals in Tokyo, and this year, hopefully, we come out with more, or at least equal to. But yeah, funding has been increasing, and as Ewan said before, the Bolsa Atleta, which is the athlete scholarship that comes to athletes, is unfortunately not enough for them to be able to support themselves. So they have to find a second job, and in addition to their exhausting training, they have to, be doing extra things to make that money for themselves. So as per the figures for that, the Bolsa Atleta goes from 410 reais to 16,600 reais, which is in an article written by our reporter Isabella Cruz, which is 100% worth checking out because it has a lot of figures. So yeah, that podium tier in the Bolsa Atleta is a minimum of 5,500 and a maximum of 16,600. So the more decorated athletes and the ones that have a larger chance or a higher chance of winning medals are able to get that higher end of the Bolsa Atleta. But still, it doesn't, when you translate it to dollars, it's really not enough to keep the athletes going. So it's important that they're able to receive other types of compensation, such as, the medals. When they win the medals, the Olympic Committee from Brazil will give them money for those. So for the gold medal, I think the athletes are going to be getting 350,000 reais. And for the silver, 210,000 reais, and for bronze, 140,000. So that will definitely be able to help them out a little bit more, especially because, the funding doesn't equate the work that they're doing.
And when we're talking about medal count, the projections that the Brazilian Olympic Committee had will probably not be met. So in Tokyo, Brazil won 21 total medals. We're probably not going to get to that point. Both to you, Ewan and Alexia, what are our main medal chances? Because Brazil had some brutal disappointments in these past few days. For instance, the men's volleyball team was eliminated by the U.S. in what was its worst outing since 1972. That had been consistently a hope for a medal in recent games, two golds and two silvers since Athens, I believe, and now from where should we expect our medals to come? The remaining ones that we may dream of.
Well, I think one of the events that people have been talking quite a lot about, even before the Olympics and now during the Olympics, seeing the team in action, has been the women's volleyball team. They're on really good form at the moment, and they looking quite comfortable in all of their kind of preliminary games, and going into the knockout stage with a decent chance of a medal there. And again, we keep talking about these women's teams here. I mean, they're in the group stage, they were quite underwhelming, but the women's football team will be fighting for a medal at some point. They've qualified for the semi-final, and regardless of whether they win that or not, they will be fighting for at least bronze. They will be playing 2 more matches, and that after what looked like a really underwhelming first 3 games in the group stage has turned into a proper, a genuine medal opportunity. And so I think there are going to be a good few more medals to come.
Let me follow up with that, because like you said, the first 3 games were bad to awful, and then Brazil, without Marta, its leading star, won against France for the first time. The French team is pretty damn good, and also Brazilians, that conspiracy theory that people were trying to rob us was really on during that game, because we had almost 20 minutes of stoppage time, almost half almost a quarter of the game in additional time in the second half, and we still held on to a 1-0 lead. We're not going to have Marta against Spain, so do you think we have a shot at going to the final?
I mean, it's going to be very difficult. Brazil played Spain's reserve side essentially in their final group match, and they lost that one. That's where Marta got sent off for what could end up being her final participation with the Brazilian national team. We don't know whether she will make it back for a potential final or a bronze medal match, whether she would be selected. And now, playing against Spain's first team, you would imagine, everything that Spain has to offer, I think it's going to be a very difficult prospect for Brazil to go through. But as you said, I mean, they managed to beat France in the quarter-final, which is obviously very difficult against the home nation, and it was a very backs-against-the-wall performance, and having to go through that extensive stoppage time, which has been a feature of this Olympic Games so far. I mean, if anyone watched the opening game of the men's tournament, what went on between Morocco and Argentina was basically, a lot of it was down to the incredible amounts of stoppage time added on in the second half. But yeah, I mean, Brazil's in with a shout always. I definitely don't think they're favourites to make the final, but if they don't make the final, they're going to be fighting for bronze. So, that's somewhere where I don't think anyone who is keeping up with women's football expected Brazil to have a medal chance, and they're going to be fighting directly for a medal, whether that be gold, silver, or in the third place playoff for bronze. Just hours after we recorded this episode, Brazil did in fact knock out the reigning world champion Spain in the semi-final of the women's football tournament, 4-2, an amazing game of football that everyone who watched will obviously never forget. And now Brazil is going to go on to the gold medal match against the US. So major chances for medals there. At the very least, it's going to be a silver for Brazil in the women's football.
And Alexa, Brazil and the US are going to play for a shot at the final in the women's volleyball team. So if Brazil loses, considering that the men's side was already eliminated by the US, are we going to replace Japan with the US as our main Olympic foe in 2024?
Yeah. Oh, also, thanks for correcting me before on the medals. Yes, Tokyo was 21 medals, and the year before that was 19. But yeah, as to what you said, it's going to be a tough game, Brazil and the U.S. Yesterday, Tatiana Weston-Webb lost to the American and got silver in the surf. So maybe the U.S. is creeping up and going to replace Japan. But we had a pretty tight game today with the Dominican Republic in women's volleyball, and Brazil came out 3-0. So maybe that's promising. And, the Brazilians always rooting, the Brazilian people always rooting in the bench are always just super loud and always there for their players. So I think that we can come out on top of that. It's unfortunate that the men lost to the US, but we can just keep our head up and hope for the best. If anything, they'll be competing for bronze.
Yeah, I mean, as Brazilians, we have to sell our teams as the favorites, even when they're not. Well, with that, I think I'm going to wrap this episode. Ewan, thank you very much. Alexia, thank you very much.
Thanks, Gustavo.
Thanks for having me, guys. This was very fun.
And if you like Explaining Brazil, please rate us with 5 stars wherever you get your podcasts. It takes only a second, and it really helps us to reach a wider audience. Or better yet, you can subscribe to the Brazilian Report, which is the journalistic engine behind this podcast. We have a business model that relies on user subscriptions, and it's because you subscribe to our services that we can carry out original reporting on Brazil and Latin America. We have put out many award-winning stories, and we have recently been selected as the best news website in the Americas for a small local newsroom by the World Association of News Publishers. So go to brazilian.report/subscribe. My name is Gustavo Ribeiro. Thank you very much, and Explaining Brazil will be back next week.